No blood yet, only shadows and broken bones. The chamber's torches flickered along jagged stone walls, carved with the scars of centuries. 5 towering silhouettes, the apex elders stood silent in council, their forms twisting through shimmering air. At the center, Elder Kiritox tapped a clawed finger against a bone-white table, voice low and thudding. "Our domains fracture," Kiritox said. "Our warriors become predictable, strong, brutal, but trapped in tradition." He let his words hang. "We must evolve." A hush. Their ridged brows furrowed. In the Dominion's history, apex predators never deferred to another species, let alone one as fragile as human. The idea would scorch the tongues of many. But Kiritox continued. "I propose we send our cubs to a single human trainer. No guardians, no spies, no fail-safe devices. They arrive with you, we release them. 5 years alone. We entrust the future of our warrior caste to a soft-fleshed outsider." A roar broke from Elder Valtra, fists slamming the table. "Insane! You would hand our legacy to a creature whose bones we could crush with one strike?" Kiritox met him. "And yet we stagnate. We die predictable deaths. I choose to gamble on evolution." Silence swelled, heavy as stone. Finally, Elder Ma'ava, elder most concerned with tradition, said quietly, "We must decide in secrecy. Only your circle and the War Council may know. If this fails, we will bury the shame before any ills spread." So, it was decreed. In hidden halls they marked 5 cubs, strong, willful, unbroken, and sealed the plan like a lethal secret. They arrived on a day of ash-gray skies. The training facility lay on an uninhabited world, barren of life, with iron wind that shredded cloth and kicked grit into mouths. The 5 cubs disembarked. Drevion, massive even for his youth, Halra, lithe and sharp, Yaska, broad-shouldered and skeptical, Norix, lean and calculating, and Tessa, bone-hard in gaze. Their scales glinted, talons flexed, muscles taut. They were warriors bred for domination. They waited, no introduction, no ceremony. Then came the man. He stepped from a hatch in the facility's command dome. He was lean, scarred, graying at temples. He wore plain clothes, nothing ornate, no weapon strapped. His gait was measured, calm. He stopped some meters before the cubs, raised his chin and nod. His eyes had seen war. He said, "I'm Thomas Reed," voice flat, unadorned. The cubs snorted. Halra hissed, "We expected an army, not a lamb." Yaska growled in agreement. Thomas did not react. He simply studied them. A soft wind kicked grit across the platform. The only sound was sand in stony hollows. Then he said, "First match. Choose opponents." Confused murmurs. No rules, no context. Finally, Drevion lunged at Yaska, claws aimed. The cubs tensed to intervene, but Thomas strode forward and stepped between them. With motion so sudden most would miss it, he twisted Yaska's arm mid-air, pivoted, and slid Yaska's balance off axis. A crack echoed. Yaska fell heavy. He reversed, moved to Drevion's flank, thrust an elbow into his rib, tipping him. In under 2 seconds both cubs lay prone, arms pinned or throats held. Silence. The cubs froze, jaws slack, muscles frozen. None had ever seen a human defeat a Krelltak. Thomas released his hold. Yaska gasped, chest heaving. Drevion scrambled up, eyes blazing. Finally Halra whispered, "Why is Apex wearing human skin?" The words echoed in still air. 5 heads turned to him. In that silence the human's face remained impassive. He said, "You asked the first question. I'll allow no other insults." That cracked the tension. The cubs snarled, bristled, but none moved. They left the arena bruised in spirit more than body. Yaska gingerly rubbed a rib. Drevion's pride stung. At dusk, in the sparse quarters, Thomas distributed water rations and protein mush. The cubs glared, refusing to sit near him. Drevion spat, "Do you plan to feed us with kind words?" Thomas lowered his container and said softly, "I feed you results. You will train tomorrow at dawn. I expect full effort, or you may regret your pride." No threats, no bravado, but weight lay behind each word. The next morning came brutal. Thomas began with endurance runs across the pitted terrain. He made them carry weights, improvise maneuvers, dodge razor gusts. When Halra's leg gave out, she fell. Thomas halted the group. He watched her writhe in pain, then knelt and helped her to stand. Not with indulgence, but insistence. Push through pain, he said, but know your limits. Halra limped. Thomas nodded. He did not mock. He did not spare her, but shifted her load until she could carry it. They tested him. Norix lunged in challenge, Tessa refused commands, Drevion sought dominance. Thomas let them flounder. He never yelled. He simply restarted the drill, reset expectations. They collapsed in exhaustion, scratched, bleeding. He performed no pampering. He had them sit, cool, and breathe. He mapped vitals, noted lactic acid buildup, allowed no quitting. On the third day, during a sparring rotation, a hammer blow from Drevion, too fast for him to dodge, caught Thomas's shoulder. He cried out, a sick crack. The cubs froze. Thomas sagged. He stumbled, pain flaring. In that moment, the cubs saw a flaw. They surged, claws extended, but Thomas held up one bloody hand. Stop, his voice strained. They paused. He grimaced, but pressed onward across the ground. He wrapped the shoulder with torn cloth, hissed at the pain. He stepped back into the drill, slower, holding the injured arm close. He recovered gradually. Over the next week, he slept less, walked slower. He limped a little. He still trained them, modified drills. He consulted scant records. He cooled down, stretched, pulled subtle rehab exercises. The cubs watched. They whispered among themselves. The man bleeds, the man slows, the man endures. And that was part of his lesson. Weeks passed. Their nightmares came in dreams, visions of being slaughtered by unseen strategy, failing to predict. The human let them fail drills. He watched them bleed. He patched wounds. The cubs' pride cracked. They began to ask questions not in derision, but in grudging curiosity. At dawn of the 40th day, Thomas gathered them. We begin ambush training. You learn terrain, deception, exhaustion build. You make traps with what is here. He handed them nothing. They eyed him. He said, the world fights without rules. You adapt or die. I will watch. They plunged into the rocky hollow, scrambling, setting deadfall traps, shadows, misleads. At midday, Halra triggered a trap. She buried herself. Her shriek echoed. Thomas was there, ripping net strands, freeing her, applying pressure to torn muscle. He bound the wound with strips of his shirt, gave her water. He did not scold. He asked quietly, why did you ride ahead? She said nothing at first. She looked at him, odd respect dawning. He nodded. Learn the terrain better next time. Know your step before you take it. That night, under the cold stars, the cubs gathered around him at a flickering campfire. Drevion said, you are no apex. You are human. Thomas smiled faintly. Then you will learn human strength. A ripple of confusion. Halra added softly, maybe strength is not only force. He stared into the fire. Shadows danced across his scarred face. Strength is choosing your fight, walking through pain, shaping fate from weakness. They listened. So, the first month ended. The cubs were changed, angry, wounded, curious. They no longer sneered openly. They no longer tested every moment. In place of raw ferocity, a spark glinted. Something disciplined, something hungry to learn. And far away, in hidden council halls, the apex elders steeled themselves. They had placed their bet. Their heirs would return in 5 years, with the man in human skin at their back, or the lineage would fracture forever. The sun on Vacos 9 didn't rise so much as burn its way upward through a haze of static-charged dust. Each morning began with a hiss of ozone and a flicker of distant storms. The cubs, once full of snarls and defiance, now rose early, sometimes before Thomas called them out, not because they liked it, because they feared what would happen if they weren't ready. On the 61st day, Thomas introduced them to controlled chaos. He laid out nothing but a square marked in the ground, 20 meters across, rocks lining its edge. One of you will defend this square, the others try to get in. Rules: no killing, no permanent injury. Do whatever you think works. Yaska volunteered to defend first, scoffing. Simple. I swat them down like insects. He spread his stance wide, claws flexed, tail whipping. The others charged. 3 seconds in, Norix feinted left while Tessa ducked under Yaska's guard. He didn't even see her until she launched into his back. Drevion followed with a tackle to the knees. Yaska snarled as he hit the dirt, pride bruised. Thomas knelt beside him afterward. Power is nothing without awareness. You look strong until the first real distraction. Yaska scowled but said nothing. The next round he lasted longer. They rotated roles. Halra, fastest among them, nearly made it through untouched, dancing between strikes with a smirk growing on her face until Thomas suddenly called out, "Now, imagine you're tired." 10 seconds in, he tossed a small weight pack onto her shoulders. She staggered, off balance. Norix swept her legs and brought her down cleanly. The lesson landed harder than the fall. You train for when you're strong, Thomas said, but fights happen when you're weak, tired, hungry, scared. The ones who win don't just know how to hit, they know when to not. That night around the fire, Drevion grunted, "You talk like you've lost." Thomas didn't meet his eyes. Every good soldier has, more than once. They didn't push him for more, but the silence between them deepened, turned thoughtful. The 3rd month, the cold set in. Vacos 9 didn't have seasons, just climate phases. The wind stiffened, coming down from the razor cliffs, carrying microscopic ice shards. The cub's scales dulled, lips cracked, movement slowed. Thomas issued no gear. He made them build shelter from debris, fashion insulation from local plants and thermal stones. Tessa approached him one evening, her fingers raw and trembling. "Why not just give us what we need?" Thomas didn't answer at first. He was boiling herbs over a portable burner. His breath was shallow that week, chest still sore from a recent impact drill where Yaska had slammed into him too hard. 2 ribs had cracked. The bruising down his side showed in green and purple when he changed his shirt, though he tried to hide it. "You'll never be given what you need out there," he said finally. "Better to learn how to take it or make it." She looked at him then, really looked, at the way he sat stiffly, left side guarded, eyes sunken from poor sleep. She didn't say anything. But that night, she helped Halra patch the east wall of their shelter without being asked. 4 months in, Norix decided he could outthink the human. He built an elaborate ambush, digging pits, rigging snares, even using scent masking paste from local fungus. It was clever, effective, even. But Thomas walked right into it and never fell for a single trap. Later, Norix scowled during debrief. "You saw it coming." "No," Thomas said. "I saw you watching." It was a small thing. A slight shift in posture. The way Norix had stared too long at a boulder that turned out to be covering a snare. Thomas hadn't outmuscled him. He'd read him. "You're not a predator until you can hide your intent," he said. "Not just your body, your mind." Norix sulked for a week. But he started watching his own tells. He spoke less. His movements became less rigid, more reactive. By the 6th month, Thomas's shoulder had mostly healed. He still couldn't lift his arm fully without wincing, but he used it. Slowly. Carefully. The cubs noticed. "Why not let the machines fix it?" Halra asked one night. "Because they won't be there in the middle of a crater or an ambush zone," he replied. "If your body doesn't know how to heal under pressure, your enemy will teach it with a blade." They weren't quite ready to admire him, but they stopped mocking. Late in month 7, something went wrong. Drevion, during a mock ambush drill, got too aggressive. The terrain had changed. Unseen rain, days earlier, had shifted the rocks beneath their ambush site. He lunged from a ledge onto Halra, but the ledge gave. He tumbled, slammed down onto a jagged stone below. The impact split open his thigh, blood sprayed. The others froze. Halra called out. Thomas was there in seconds. His voice dropped into cold clinical command. "Tessa, compress here. Norix, find the green plant with narrow leaves fast. Halra, hold his head. Don't let him move." He cauterized the wound himself. Steady hands, while Drevion howled. Wrapped it. Elevated the leg. Injected a stabilizer. Not once did he raise his voice. Not once did he tremble. Drevion fell unconscious from shock, then woke hours later inside the shelter, leg bound, pain dulled by basic field meds. He looked around, then locked eyes with Thomas. "You didn't blame me," he rasped. "No," Thomas said. "You already knew it was your mistake. You didn't panic." "I can't afford to panic." After that, the Cubs stopped testing him the same way. Not out of fear, but out of growing understanding. By the end of the first year, something had shifted. The Cubs still snarled, still fought, but they did so with focus. They learned how to breathe through strain, how to pace themselves through cold, how to improvise with broken tools. When Tessa lost a tooth in a sparring match, she laughed, then picked it up and kept going. When Norik split his palm open on an obsidian shard, he asked Thomas to show him how to stitch it. Thomas didn't teach dominance, he taught damage control, timing, planning 2 steps ahead, recognizing traps, using terrain, reading eyes, and he taught failure. Quietly, constantly, ruthlessly. On the anniversary of their arrival, the Cubs awoke to find Thomas already outside, a long scar down his left thigh visible in the morning light. He held a curved blade. "Today we spar, all of you, together, against me." They hesitated. "You're injured," said Halra. "That's madness." Thomas shrugged. "So was sending 5 apex predator cubs to live with me for 5 years. Let's see what it bought." They attacked together. The battle didn't last long, not because they were weak, but because they had learned to anticipate, to think, to work as a unit. They cornered him. He landed 3 strikes. Dravion feinted, Halra flanked. Tessa slid low, while Norix drew him into Yaska's grasp. Thomas ended up flat on his back, laughing for the first time any of them had heard. "You finally stopped trying to be stronger than me." Tessa offered a hand. "We're not. We're just smarter now." He took the hand and let her pull him up. "Now you're becoming dangerous." Later that night, by firelight, Thomas passed around battered metal cups. Inside, not protein mush, but real broth. Rare, warm, and flavorful. A gift hoarded from old supply crates. Dravion raised his. "To not being crushed by tradition," Tessa added, "and to being dangerous in all the right ways." Thomas simply drank. His eyes never left the fire. Somewhere in the wind, the apex elders waited, still silent, still uncertain, but the Cubs had begun to change. And Thomas Reed, the soft-skinned human with a body full of injuries and a mind like a storm, had only just begun to teach them. By the start of the second year, the Cubs no longer looked like cubs. They moved lower to the ground, tighter in posture. Their shoulders didn't jut out. In defiance, they curled inward, ready to coil or spring. They walked silently, without thinking about it. And when they spoke, they did so with words first, claws second. But no ceremony marked the change. Just a quiet morning drill like any other, and Thomas watching from a crag, arms folded, ribs bound again. He'd torn one of the intercostals during a breath control demo 2 days prior. Still refused rest, just adjusted his movements, slower and tighter, breath kept short and efficient. The Cubs had stopped offering to help, not because they didn't care, because they knew better now. His pain was his training, same as theirs. This was the year they learned how to lose. It started with fire. Thomas had watched the dry lightning on the northern ridge all week. "The air's changing," he said, sniffing the ozone. The Cubs didn't understand. Until a freak strike set the valley brush alight. They were mid-drill in the lower ravine when the smoke came. Halra was the first to cough. Then Norik smelled it burning alkali from the dry crest vines. "Uphill," Thomas snapped. "Now." They scrambled. Tessa fell when a rock gave way. Dravion hauled her up. No one barked orders, they moved like a unit. Smoke filled their lungs. Ash stung their eyes. Thomas led them through a narrowing canyon, his map memorized, every step carved in the dirt of memory. But halfway through, a deadfall collapsed, charred roots twisting down. A branch slammed into Thomas's leg. He didn't cry out, but his pace faltered. Norix doubled back, saw the blood. "Bone?" he asked. Thomas didn't look. "Tibia's cracked. Maybe worse." "No time. Keep moving." He limped faster than most would run. They reached a ridgeline an hour later. Safe. Soot-covered. Wheezing. Then collapsed. Thomas didn't speak until the pain subsided. When he finally checked the leg, the fibula was fractured, not a full break, but enough to sideline any normal combat instructor. He took his time treating it, showing them each step. Sprain the ankle, the foot compensates. Fracture the leg, the spine compensates. Pain travels, you have to respect the chain. Tessa leaned in. So, you'll stop training now? He looked up at her with a face full of dirt, sweat, and tired rage. We adapt. The next day, he trained them from a seated position. Tactical callouts, breath cues, mental pattern recognition, watching their footwork, correcting stance, timing their breath to blow intervals. And they listened. Month 18 introduced a new layer, mental pressure, not pain, but deception. Thomas set up scavenger hunts across a 30-kilometer stretch of highlands, where terrain changed every few kilometers, wet shale, narrow ledges, freezing wind tunnels. Each cub was sent alone, with a map containing 3 false leads and 1 real objective. Most failed the first time. Halra got turned around by mirrored landmarks. Norix followed a perfect trail to an ambush site one Thomas had set days in advance, just in case. Yaska over-relied on strength, trying to scale a cliff that had no exit. Drevion didn't check the wind vectors, missing the cave scent entirely. Only Tessa found the objective. Not quickly, not gracefully, but efficiently. When they regrouped, Thomas didn't gloat. He sat on a rock with his leg braced and said, "Adaptation means knowing when you're wrong before it kills you." They began carrying journals, not written, but etched scratched into local bark sheets with burnt stone. Notes, guesses, tactics. They traded ideas, debated terrain logic over meals. They never would have done that a year ago. Now, it was survival. 2 months later, the fracture in Thomas's leg reopened during a canyon descent, not because of misstep, because he caught Drevion, who had slipped and would have broken his back otherwise. The pain was immediate. This time, Thomas went down hard. They stabilized him, built a litter, hauled him back over 2 kilometers of rough ground. He never once told them to stop, though his face was pale and his breath short. Once inside the shelter, Halra sterilized tools, while Norix set the bone. Yaska kept his airway clear. Tessa handled the pain injection. None of them had spoken about it, but every cub had watched and re-watched him treat his own injuries for months. They weren't just trained, they were prepared. The human slept for 2 days after that. The cubs trained themselves. By year 3, Thomas walked with a slight limp. Not always, but during the colder cycles, it worsened. He didn't hide it. The cubs respected him more for it. One morning, as the wind howled across the plains and their breath came in clouds, Halra broke the silence. "What made you start this?" she asked. They were sitting near the old radio array. It hadn't worked in years. Thomas had disabled it on purpose. "Too easy," he'd said, if someone could call for help. Thomas stared out at the horizon. "I was a soldier, Earthside, then Mars, then Europa. Did you win?" He shrugged. "Sometimes." "Did you lose anyone?" "Every time." The fire crackled. His expression didn't change, but his eyes didn't blink. "We train," he said, "because next time you don't come back, someone else has to." At the 3.5-year mark, a supply pod failed to arrive. That had never happened before. Every 200 days, a crate would drop with protein rations, medical supplies, and sometimes rarely messages. This time, nothing. The cubs didn't panic. They built a ration plan. Tessa and Norix trapped local burrow beasts. Halra identified a scrub fruit that was toxic to most, but digestible with a 3-day fermentation. Thomas watched, proud but silent. He didn't need to say it. They'd adapted. But that night, something shifted. He staggered during his patrol round, tried to hide it, failed. Norix caught him before he hit the ground. Fever. Dehydration. An old wound had reopened under the strain, one from before the cubs had ever arrived. A graft near the kidney, from an old shrapnel fragment. He was out for 3 days. This time, the cubs took over fully. Not just drills maintenance, wound care, food prep. Drevion even used the cracked communications tower to boost a local signal flare. Not for rescue, just in case the elders had forgotten where they were. Thomas recovered slowly, regaining strength by week's end. His pride didn't suffer. He let them lead drills. He offered correction, but not domination. On the fourth day post-recovery, he walked out to the training yard alone, said one word, attack. They didn't hesitate. They didn't win. But they lasted 4 times longer than they had in year 1. And this time, they forced him to sweat. The days blurred into seasons. Scar tissue thickened on every one of them. Thomas stopped needing to explain lessons, they absorbed them. Adaptation had become instinct. And with it came something harder to define: control. Drevion no longer needed to be strongest. He preferred to spot for others, to anchor group tactics. Halra had sharpened into a tactician, leading improvised strike teams. Norik spoke little, but read terrain like a second language. Yaska stopped laughing at stealth drills. Now he set the traps. Tessa, once feral in her instincts, now walked like a ghost. She carried silence like a weapon. And Thomas? He limped a little more. His skin bore new lines, deeper than scars. He wore no armor, never had, but his movements were tighter, smaller, more efficient. He barely spoke during training now. Just watched. And they moved as though his gaze was a command. By the end of the 3rd year, no cub had called him soft flesh in over a cycle. Not once. The shuttle descended 5 years to the day after the cubs had first arrived, hissing steam across a sun-bleached landing pad that hadn't seen use since their arrival. The facility, once sterile and cold, had transformed into a scarred but living monument. Cracked walls were reinforced with layered stone. Wind barriers built from scavenged steel curved protectively around the courtyard. The cubs had learned to reinforce not just bodies, but infrastructure. They stood in a line as it touched down. No ceremony, no armor, no symbols of rank. Just 5 beings, sleek, broad-shouldered, steady-eyed. And Thomas, sitting on a crate beside them, cane resting against one leg. His hair had gone silver at the temples. One of his knees clicked softly when he moved. He carried a faint tremor in his left hand that hadn't been there last year. But his eyes, if anything, had grown more focused. The shuttle door opened. The Apex Elders stepped out in silence. They expected something obvious: bulkier frames, glowing trophies, perhaps tribal scars, or elite weapons forged from exotic metals. Instead, they found cubs who barely looked at them. Yaska nodded politely, but said nothing. Norik stood at rest, hands behind his back, eyes already scanning the terrain beyond the Elders for exit points. Drevion didn't flex his muscles, he just waited. Tessa's gaze had the weight of decision behind it. And Halra? She looked smaller than the Elders remembered, but more dangerous than any warrior they'd ever trained. "You are quiet," Elder Kiratox observed. "We were taught to think before speaking," Tessa replied. Her voice had changed, lower, deliberate, firm. Kiratox's eyes flicked to Thomas. "You look diminished." Thomas stood slowly, favoring his right leg. "I'm not what I was. That wasn't the point." Kiratox tilted his head. "We expected predators. You returned them different." Thomas nodded. "Better." The evaluation began without announcement. The Elders had arranged 3 sets of tests. First, hand-to-hand duels against traditional Dominion instructors. Second, survival adaptation in unknown terrain. And third, command simulations under pressure. The cubs never asked what was expected. They just entered each arena and began. In the duels, none of them overwhelmed their opponents with force. Instead, they used movement, redirection, exhaustion. Halra let her opponent break his own stance. Yaska tripped his, using a shattered flagpole as leverage. Tessa ended hers with a single strike, precise, timed, clean. Breltok combat had always favored dominance through power. These cubs bled their opponents slowly, made them frustrated, then ended fights with finality. One observer muttered, "They fight like ghosts." Another, "Like they're not trying to win, they're just trying not to lose until you do." The survival test went worse, at least from the Elders' perspective. They watched the cubs set up a base camp within hours. They mapped the area within a day, scavenged materials from old wreckage, and by the 3rd day had fortified and patrolled the whole terrain. No deaths, no injuries, no frantic moves, just relentless adaptation. "They made it boring," one elder complained. Thomas, who watched from the viewing platform, said quietly, "They made it efficient." The simulation test was the final blow. 3 battlefronts, simulated loss of communication, munitions failure, civilian pressure, traditional training taught to prioritize command hierarchy, maintain formation, avoid improvisation. The Cubs did none of that. They fractured their unit on purpose, split into mobile trios, circled objectives from flanks, used debris, and false transmissions. At one point, Drevion faked a breach in their system so the enemy AI would reroute. Norix led an ambush, using their own shadows against the sun's angle. They won all 3 scenarios in record time. But more importantly, they did it without casualties. The elders were silent that night. They sat in the old council room at the top of the training facility, staring down at the hard-packed earth where 5 years had carved lessons into stone and blood. Elder Maava finally said, "They do not resemble us." "No," Kiritox agreed. "They are not Apex in the old way." "No," he said again. Elder Valtra growled low in his chest. "Then what are they?" Kiritox looked toward the dark outline of the training fields. "Something new." The next morning, Thomas gathered the Cubs one last time. The fire pit crackled gently. He hadn't lit one in months, hadn't needed to. But this time he did, not for warmth, but for gravity. "I have nothing else to teach you," he said. No one moved. "I've broken you, let you break yourselves, watched you bleed, fail, starve, claw your way through pain that doesn't get a name, but you kept going. That's it. That's the whole thing. Not strength, not speed, just getting back up smarter." Yaska cleared his throat. "You'll stay here?" Thomas gave a soft shrug. "I go where I'm needed, not always forward, sometimes nowhere." Halra frowned. "What happens to this place?" He looked around. At the walls they'd rebuilt, at the notches in the stone from old drills, at the dark smudge near the medical table where he'd once set Norix's shoulder with grit teeth and a snapped branch. "This place already became something else," he said. "It's yours now." They stood in silence, not out of grief, but out of understanding. They didn't need farewell speeches. They had his limp, his scars, his stories. They carried his lessons in the way they crouched during rest, in how they counted their heartbeats before a fight. Before they left, each one did something Thomas didn't expect. They saluted him. Not a military salute, not a Dominion gesture, just a slow, closed fist pressed over the chest, something he'd once done after setting a bone in the dark, thinking they hadn't noticed. And then they were gone. In the years that followed, stories spread. Of Kreltak warriors who moved without sound, who could weaponize the terrain, who knew how to fight tired, wounded, hungry, and still win. They didn't overpower their enemies, they outlasted them, outsmarted them. They became phantoms of the battlefield. Other species tried to mimic their style. Some sent scouts to find the training grounds. Others attempted to recruit Thomas Reed himself. But no one ever found him. Some say he retired to the asteroid belt beyond Sora Prime. Others claim he died in silence, buried under a false name, with his cane by his side. And some those who knew better say he's still out there, watching, limping slowly across broken ground, waiting for the next set of cubs. When asked, every one of the original 5 gave the same answer when pressed for how they became what they were. "We trained with the human." And when one youngling asked, during a Kreltak ceremony decades later, "But how? He was soft skin. How did he survive you?" Drevion, older now, scarred deeper, only smiled. "He didn't need to survive us," he said. "He made us survive him." And far off, in the memory of that dead world where they learned pain and patience, the wind still whispered across the rocks. The legend remained. A man. No armor, no weapons, just scars. And 5 apex predators, who called him teacher,